The Boeing 787's cabin lights dimmed as Flight 447 crossed into international waters, 39,000 feet above the Pacific. In Seat 12D, billionaire defense contractor Valentina Reyes appeared to sleep, her Hermes blazer draped perfectly, diamond earrings catching the overhead reading light. The flight attendants whispered about her. Youngest woman to build $1 billion aerospace empire, they said. Tech magazines called her the Missile Princess. What they didn't know was that Valentina Reyes had been dead for 6 hours. The woman in 12D wasn't sleeping. She was calculating. Every breath measured, every micro-movement planned. Through half-closed eyelids, she watched the Navy SEAL team that had boarded in Anchorage during the routine maintenance stop. They thought they were clever, scattered throughout business class in civilian clothes, but she recognized the tells. The way Thompson kept checking his watch, how Rodriguez's eyes swept the cabin in tactical patterns, the subtle bulge of Morrison's sidearm beneath his polo shirt. They'd found the real Valentina Reyes in her Malibu compound, that morning, execution-style, single shot behind the ear. Professional work. The kind that suggested someone wanted her empire, her government contracts, her access to classified propulsion technology. What they hadn't counted on was Lieutenant Colonel Zara Akafor, callsign Phantom, who'd been deep undercover as Ray's personal pilot for 8 months. The SEALs thought they were protecting a high-value target. They had no idea they were guarding an imposter who could fly anything with wings, and had killed 17 enemies with her bare hands across 3 theaters of war. Zara felt the familiar pre-combat calm settle over her, that crystalline focus that had earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross and 3 Purple Hearts before the Pentagon, buried her service record so deep it might as well have been fiction. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Tokyo," the captain announced. His voice carried the slight tremor that told Zara he was in on whatever operation was about to unfold. She'd flown enough classified missions to recognize when civilian infrastructure was being used for military purposes. The SEAL leader, Thompson, shifted in his seat 3 rows ahead. Through the reflection in the window, Zara watched him receive a text message. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly. Morrison and Rodriguez were moving now, the careful shuffle of operators positioning themselves for action. Zara's fingers found the hidden ceramic knife taped beneath the armrest, a trick she'd learned from a Spetsnaz defector in Afghanistan. The Ray's identity had been her longest cover, but it was about to be blown. In approximately 90 seconds, when the plane hit the predetermined altitude, these SEALs would discover that the billionaire defense contractor they were supposed to protect had been replaced by something far more dangerous. The descent began, and with it, the end of Valentina Reyes forever. Thunder rolled outside the aircraft windows as Flight 447 dropped through a wall of storm clouds, the cabin shuddering with turbulence that felt almost intentional. Zara maintained her sleeping facade while monitoring the SEAL's increasingly tense body language. Thompson had moved to the aisle seat directly behind her, close enough that she could smell his standard-issue aftershave and hear the soft click of him chambering around. The plane's intercom crackled to life, but instead of the captain's voice, a different tone emerged, clipped, military precision. "All passengers remain seated. This aircraft is now under federal jurisdiction. Any movement will be considered hostile." Around the cabin, confused murmurs erupted from genuine passengers, but Zara noticed how quickly they were silenced by what she now realized were additional operators scattered throughout the plane. This wasn't just a SEAL team. This was a full extraction operation disguised as a commercial flight. "Target acquired," Thompson whispered into his throat mic, so quietly most people wouldn't have heard it. But Zara had spent years in environments where missing a whisper meant death. Subject appears unconscious, moving to secure. Through the window, Zara caught sight of something that made her blood freeze. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets flanking the aircraft, their navigation lights piercing the storm like predatory eyes. This wasn't protection. This was a cage at 35,000 feet, and she was the bird they intended to capture alive. The ceramic knife felt warm against her palm now, but 6 armed SEALs in an enclosed space meant she needed to think beyond close-quarters combat. Her eyes traced the aircraft systems, emergency oxygen masks, life vests, the subtle vibration in the floor that indicated the cargo bay directly beneath them. Years of tactical flight experience had taught her to see aircraft as three-dimensional battle spaces, not just transportation. Thompson's hand was reaching for her shoulder when the lights went out. Emergency lighting bathed the cabin in hellish red as Zara exploded into motion. The ceramic blade found Thompson's wrist before he could draw his weapon, severing tendons with surgical precision. His scream mixed with the sudden depressurization alarm as she yanked the emergency oxygen mask deployment system, filling the cabin with dangling masks and chaos. "Hostile, hostile," Rodriguez was shouting into his radio, but his words were lost in the cacophony of panicking passengers and rushing air. Zara rolled across the aisle, using Thompson's body as a shield while her mind calculated vectors and possibilities. The Super Hornets outside had shifted position, moving closer to the aircraft's wings. Whatever this operation was, they wanted Valentina Reyes alive badly enough to risk 100 civilian lives. But they'd made one critical error in their intelligence. They thought they were hunting a billionaire. Instead, they'd caged Phantom, the most lethal pilot in U.S. military history, and she just remembered why the Pentagon had tried so hard to erase her existence. The storm outside seemed to respond to the chaos within, lightning illuminating the Super Hornets as they began their escort pattern. 34,000 feet and falling, with nowhere to run except down. Morrison had his weapon drawn now, shouting orders to the terrified passengers, but Zara was already 3 moves ahead. The cargo bay access panel was 12 feet away, behind 2 more SEALs and through a gauntlet of screaming civilians. Under normal circumstances, impossible. But Phantom had never operated under normal circumstances. She moved like liquid death through the chaos, using the emergency lighting and swaying oxygen masks as cover. Rodriguez tried to intercept her, but she redirected his momentum into the bathroom door with a joint lock that sent him sprawling. Morrison's shot went wide as she dropped below the seat line, the bullet punching through the cabin wall and triggering another depressurization alarm. The aircraft shuddered violently, whether from the storm or the structural damage. Zara couldn't tell. But she could feel the pilot fighting to maintain control, the subtle shifts in engine pitch and wing angle that spoke of a veteran aviator dealing with multiple system failures. Her fingers found the cargo access panel as Morrison rounded the corner, weapon trained on her center mass. Time crystallized into that moment every warrior knows, the split second where training meets instinct, and either you live or you don't. "Stand down, Phantom," Morrison said, and hearing her real call sign from his lips sent ice through her veins. "We know who you are." The ceramic knife spun through the air, catching Morrison in the shoulder and spinning him around. But his words echoed in her mind as she dropped through the access panel into the cargo bay. They knew, which meant the Valentina Reyes identity hadn't just been blown, it had been a trap from the beginning. The cargo bay was a maze of containers and luggage, dimly lit by emergency strips that cast everything in blood-red shadows. Above her, she could hear the SEALs regrouping, their voices tight with professional frustration. Thompson was screaming about his severed wrist while Rodriguez coordinated with someone on the ground. Zara pressed herself against a shipping container, mind racing through possibilities. The aircraft was losing altitude steadily now, whether from the gunshot damage or pilot intent. The Super Hornets outside were maintaining formation, which meant they had orders to escort, not engage. Yet, her fingers found her encrypted satellite phone, a piece of technology that shouldn't exist according to most intelligence agencies. The signal was weak at altitude, but enough to send a burst transmission to a contact who'd been silent for 3 years. Raven, this is Phantom. Package compromised. Need immediate extraction. The response came back within seconds, just 2 words that changed everything. Negative, Ghost. Ghost Protocol, the most feared designation in black operations. It meant she was officially dead, her records burned, her contacts severed. It meant whatever she'd stumbled into as Valentina Reyes was big enough that her own government was willing to sacrifice one of their best assets to keep it buried. The aircraft lurched suddenly, engines changing pitch. Through the cargo bay's small porthole, Zara saw the lights of what looked like a military airfield approaching through the storm. Not Tokyo, somewhere else entirely. Above her, the SEALs had gone quiet, which in her experience was infinitely more dangerous than their earlier chaos. They were setting up a containment perimeter, probably planning to gas the cargo bay or use some other non-lethal method to incapacitate her. She looked around the cramped space, noting the cargo manifest visible in the emergency lighting. Container after container marked with symbols she recognized from her deepest black operations: biological hazard, chemical weapons, experimental materials. This wasn't a passenger flight that had been commandeered. This was a covert transport using civilian cover, and she'd walked right into the heart of something that apparently warranted killing a billionaire and activating Ghost Protocol. The engines were spooling down now, landing gear deploying. Whatever was about to happen would happen on the ground, where the opposition would have overwhelming tactical advantage. Unless Phantom remembered that cages only worked if the bird inside wanted to stay caged. The aircraft touched down with a jarring impact that sent containers sliding across the cargo bay floor. Zara braced herself against the bulkhead, feeling the familiar deceleration of a military landing, hard, fast, and precise. Through the small porthole, she glimpsed the silhouettes of armed vehicles racing alongside the aircraft, their headlights cutting through the storm like hunting spotlights. The engines wound down to silence, replaced by the mechanical sounds of ground equipment connecting to the aircraft. She heard the distinctive whine of jetway systems, but also something else: the rumble of heavy machinery, the kind used for cargo operations at secure facilities. Above her, Thompson's voice cut through the metal. Ground teams are in position. Subject is contained in the cargo bay. We're going to flood it with gas in 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Zara's eyes swept the container around her, noting the shipping labels more carefully now. Meridian Dynamics, Valentina Reyes' own company. The containers bore her corporate logo, which meant this cargo was part of whatever had gotten the real Reyes killed. She pried open the nearest container with the damaged ceramic knife, revealing foam-packed components that made her blood run cold. Guidance systems. Not just any guidance systems, but the new quantum-encrypted navigation modules that were supposed to be theoretical. Components that could make any missile or aircraft completely invisible to current defense systems. The hiss of gas entering the cargo bay reached her ears. Military-grade knockout agent, judging by the sweet metallic smell. She had maybe 2 minutes before unconsciousness, less if they'd calculated for her body weight. But they'd made another critical error. They assumed Phantom would try to escape. Instead, she armed the container's self-destruct mechanism. Every Meridian Dynamics shipment of classified materials included a thermite charge designed to prevent enemy acquisition. The real Valentina Reyes had insisted on it, one of the few security protocols that had impressed Zara during her undercover assignment. The countdown timer glowed red in the darkness. 60 seconds. Gas is deployed, Thompson reported above. Target should be unconscious in 90 seconds. 85 seconds before she passed out. 60 before the entire cargo bay became a furnace hot enough to melt steel. She pulled on the emergency oxygen mask from a nearby safety station, buying herself precious additional time as the knockout gas swirled around her. Through the porthole, she watched ground teams positioning themselves. At least 20 operatives, all carrying the latest tactical equipment. but they were positioning for a capture operation, not a firefight. They expected to pull an unconscious woman from the cargo bay, not deal with a phoenix rising from flames. 50 seconds on the timer. Her satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message from a number she didn't recognize. "Phantom, this is Raven. Package has gone dark. You are clear to engage." Raven, her old handler, the one who'd supposedly died in Syria 2 years ago. If he was alive and breaking communication silence, it meant the ghost protocol had been issued by someone he didn't trust. 40 seconds. The gas was making her movements sluggish despite the oxygen mask. Time to move. She triggered the manual cargo door release, sending the massive bay door sliding open with a mechanical grinding that echoed across the tarmac. Storm, wind, and rain whipped through the opening, dispersing the knockout gas and giving her a clear view of the tactical teams below. "Cargo bay is opening," someone shouted. "Repeat, cargo bay is opening." 30 seconds on the thermite timer. Zara clipped herself to the aircraft's cargo loading system and began her descent toward the tarmac, moving through the mechanical arms and conveyors like a spider descending its web. 20 seconds. The tactical teams were converging, but they were still operating under capture protocols. Non-lethal weapons, containment formations. They had no idea she was about to turn their secure facility into a crater. The gas had cleared enough for her to see the facility's layout: hangars, control towers, fuel depots. A black site, probably CIA or NSA, designed for operations that officially didn't exist. 10 seconds. She hit the tarmac running, diving behind a fuel truck as the first tranquilizer darts whistled past her head. The cargo bay erupted in white-hot fire, thermite reaching temperatures that turned metal into vapor. The explosion lit up the storm like artificial daylight, and in that moment of illumination, Zara saw something that made her understand why they'd been willing to kill a billionaire and activate Ghost Protocol. Parked in the hangars were aircraft that didn't officially exist, prototypes using the quantum guidance systems she just destroyed. Not just experimental fighters, but bombers. Stealth technology decades ahead of anything in the public record. Someone was building a shadow air force, and Valentina Reyes had been the key supplier. The explosion's shockwave knocked several tactical team members off their feet, buying Zara precious seconds to assess her situation. The fuel truck she'd sheltered behind was already starting to smoke from the heat, and she could hear the whine of approaching vehicles, reinforcements closing the perimeter. But the thermite fire had also triggered the facility's emergency protocols. Alarm klaxons wailed across the base as automatic fire suppression systems activated, filling the air with chemical foam that would provide excellent concealment for someone who knew how to use it. Zara rolled under the fuel truck as boots thundered past her position. The tactical teams were shouting coordinates into their radios, trying to re-establish containment, but the explosion had thrown their careful plans into chaos. She could hear Thompson barking orders, his voice tight with pain from his wounded wrist. "Perimeter breach at Hangar 7. Subject is mobile and armed." She wasn't at Hangar 7. That was a misdirection she'd created by throwing a piece of burning debris in that direction. But it told her something valuable about the facility's layout. 7 hangars, which meant more prototype aircraft than she'd initially spotted. The satellite phone buzzed against her ribs. Another message from Raven: "Extraction impossible. Recommend Scorched Earth Protocol." Scorched Earth. Destroy everything and disappear. It was the nuclear option, reserved for operations that had gone so catastrophically wrong that preserving secrecy was worth more than any individual life. Through the chaos, she heard a sound that made her freeze: jet engines spooling up. Someone was preparing to move the prototype aircraft, probably to a secondary location. If those planes disappeared into the black world of unacknowledged programs, the technology she just glimpsed would be lost forever. The foam was providing good concealment, but it was also making movement difficult. Her boots struggled for traction on the slick tarmac as she low-crawled toward Hangar 7, where the misdirected tactical teams were now sweeping for her. That's when she saw him, a figure in a general's uniform standing near the hangar entrance, apparently immune to the chaos around him. Even through the foam and smoke, she recognized the bearing, the way he held his shoulders. General Marcus Thorne, former head of Special Operations Command, supposedly retired 2 years ago. If Thorne was here, it meant this operation went all the way to the Pentagon's deepest levels. It also meant they weren't just building a shadow air force, they were preparing for something specific. A distant rumble drew her attention skyward. Through the storm clouds, she could make out the silhouettes of heavy transport aircraft approaching the field. Not rescue, resupply. Whatever timeline they were working toward, her destruction of the cargo had accelerated it. The prototype fighters in the hangars began taxiing toward the runway, their engines creating an otherworldly whine that seemed to cut through the storm itself. She counted 6 aircraft, each one representing technology that could reshape global military balance. Her phone buzzed one final time. "Phantom, you have authorization for full spectrum engagement. Repeat, full spectrum." Full spectrum meant no restrictions, no rules of engagement. It meant Phantom was officially unleashed for the first time since Afghanistan, when an entire terrorist compound had simply ceased to exist. But it also meant whoever was running this operation had been deemed an existential threat to national security. Zara checked her remaining equipment, one damaged ceramic knife, the satellite phone, and whatever improvisational weapons the facility might provide. Against 20-plus tactical operatives, General Thorne, and 6 prototype aircraft about to disappear into the night. The odds were impossible, which meant it was time to remind everyone why they'd tried to bury Phantom in the first place. The foam was beginning to dissipate, leaving Zara exposed on the open tarmac as the first prototype aircraft reached the runway threshold. She could hear the tactical teams reforming their search pattern, their voices carrying the professional frustration of operators whose carefully planned mission had devolved into chaos. But chaos was where Phantom thrived. She sprinted toward the nearest hangar, using the remaining cover of smoke and foam to mask her movement. The building loomed ahead, its massive doors partially open to reveal the sophisticated maintenance equipment inside. More importantly, she could see fuel lines, hydraulic systems, and electrical panels, the vulnerable nervous system of any aircraft facility. Target spotted, moving toward Hangar 2. The shout came from behind her, followed by the distinct pop of tranquilizer guns. She felt a dart graze her shoulder, tearing fabric but missing flesh by millimeters. Inside the hangar, she found herself in a cathedral of military technology. Maintenance scaffolding surrounded another prototype aircraft, sleeker than the ones taxiing outside, its surface seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. This wasn't just stealth technology. It was something beyond current physics. Her satellite phone displayed a new message from Raven. Aircraft designation, Project Ghostwind, quantum metamaterial cloaking, invisible to all known detection methods. Invisible aircraft. That's why they'd killed Valentina Reyes, why they'd activated Ghost Protocol. Someone was preparing to wage a war where the enemy couldn't see them coming. Footsteps echoed from the hangar entrance as the tactical team closed in. Zara climbed the maintenance scaffolding surrounding the Ghostwind prototype, her mind racing through possibilities. She needed to disable not just this aircraft, but the entire program. "Phantom," Thompson's voice boomed across the hangar. "There's nowhere to run. Surrender now and we can end this without more bloodshed." She almost laughed at that. They'd already killed Valentina Reyes, activated Ghost Protocol, and were preparing to deploy invisible aircraft for unknown purposes. The bloodshed had started long before she'd entered the picture. From her elevated position, she could see the full scope of the facility through the hangar's windows. 8 hangars total, not 7. And in the distance, what looked like a command center with communication arrays pointing skyward. This wasn't just a development facility, it was operational headquarters. The Ghostwind aircraft's cockpit was open, systems powered down but accessible. If she could access its navigation computer, she might be able to determine the program's intended targets. She dropped silently into the cockpit, her fingers dancing across touchscreens that responded to her presence with holographic displays. The quantum guidance system was even more sophisticated than she'd imagined, capable of plotting courses that existed in mathematical probability rather than physical space. The mission parameters made her blood freeze. Target coordinates for major population centers across 3 continents. Not military installations, but cities. Millions of civilians. Jesus, she whispered, understanding finally why Raven had authorized full-spectrum engagement. Step away from the aircraft. Thompson had reached the base of the scaffolding, his wounded hand wrapped in field dressing but his weapon steady in his offhand. Instead of complying, Zara began uploading the Ghostwind's mission data to her satellite phone. Whatever shadow organization was behind this, their plans were about to be transmitted to every intelligence agency that might be able to stop them. The upload progress bar crept toward completion as Thompson began climbing the scaffolding. 80%, 90. Phantom, I know who you really are, Thompson called out. Lieutenant Colonel Zara Akaffer, Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 Purple Hearts. The Pentagon buried your record because you were too effective, not because you were unreliable. 95%. She could hear his boots on the metal steps getting closer. You're not the enemy here, Thompson continued. But the people you're trying to protect don't deserve protection. The targets in that computer. They're all sites where bioweapons research is being conducted. We're not starting a war, we're preventing one. 100%. Upload complete. Even if that were true, Zara said, not turning around, invisible aircraft targeting population centers isn't the solution. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease, Thompson replied, his voice now directly behind her. But it's still a cure. She spun, the ceramic knife's remains in her hand, but Thompson was already moving. Years of special operations training collided in the cramped cockpit as they grappled for position. The aircraft system sparked to life around them, responding to their struggle with automated safety protocols. Warning lights bathed the cockpit in red as the quantum guidance system attempted to interpret their chaotic movement as flight inputs. That's when Zara realized Thompson had made a critical error. He'd engaged her inside the Ghostwind itself, not knowing that she'd spent the last year learning every system in Meridian Dynamics inventory, including the emergency protocols. Her hand found the ejection seat activation sequence, and she had just enough time to see Thompson's eyes widen in understanding before the cockpit erupted in controlled violence. But instead of ejecting upward, she triggered the ground maintenance mode, a system designed to safely remove pilots from aircraft in hangar environments. The seat launched Thompson sideways into the scaffolding with bone-crushing force while simultaneously deploying restraint systems around Zara. The aircraft, interpreting the ejection sequence as preparation for emergency flight, began automated startup procedures. Through the canopy, she could see the tactical teams rushing toward the hangar as the Ghostwind's engines began their otherworldly whine. The prototype was preparing to taxi itself to the runway, following whatever mission profile was still loaded in its computers. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the other operators reached the aircraft, and the Ghostwind was already moving on its automated sequence. The hangar doors ahead of them were opening, revealing the storm-lashed runway where the other prototype aircraft were still preparing for departure. Zara made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who hadn't spent years flying the most dangerous missions in military history. Instead of trying to stop the aircraft or escape from it, she began overriding the automated systems. If Phantom was going to steal a prototype stealth fighter, she was going to do it properly. The Ghostwind responded to her inputs like a living thing, its quantum-enhanced system seeming to anticipate her intentions before she fully formed them. The aircraft rolled out of the hangar with increasing speed, its cloaking systems automatically engaging as it detected the storm's electromagnetic signature. Through the cockpit displays, she watched herself disappear from every sensor on the base. To the tactical teams below, the Ghostwind had simply vanished, even though they could hear its engines and see the disturbed air of its passage. "Ghost One is airborne," someone was shouting over the radio frequencies. "Repeat, Ghost One has been compromised and is airborne." Ghost One, so they had names for these invisible nightmares. The aircraft's targeting system was trying to engage the pre-programmed mission profile, overlaying potential weapon deployment patterns across her display. Cities marked for destruction, each one represented by a cold blue dot that might as well have been a gravestone for millions. But the Ghostwind wasn't armed yet. The weapon systems showed empty pylons, waiting for ordnance that was probably stored elsewhere on the facility. She had a temporarily invisible aircraft with no weapons, being pursued by what sounded like half the U.S. military, carrying mission data that could prevent or start World War III depending on who received it first. The storm outside seemed to embrace the Ghostwind's cloaking technology, lightning fracturing around the aircraft's quantum field in patterns that hurt to look at directly. She was flying through weather that would have grounded conventional aircraft, but the prototype systems compensated for conditions that shouldn't have been survivable. Her satellite phone chimed with an encrypted message. "Phantom, this is Raven. Signal received and distributed. You need to reach Langley alive. Others are moving to intercept." Others, that could mean rescue or additional hostiles, depending on which faction within the intelligence community was playing which game. But Langley meant CIA headquarters, which suggested Raven believed at least some elements of the agency weren't compromised. The radio crackled to life. "Ghost One, this is General Thorne. Return to base immediately. You're interfering with a classified national security operation." Zara keyed the mic, her voice carrying the ice-cold authority that had once made terrorist leaders surrender rather than face her in combat. "General, this is Lieutenant Colonel Zara Akafor, call sign Phantom. You're under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and planning terrorist attacks against civilian populations." Silence stretched across the radio frequency, broken only by the storm's static. Then Thorne's voice returned, carrying a note of something that might have been admiration. "Phantom, we'd heard the stories, but we thought you were dead." "I was," she replied, banking the Ghostwind toward the coordinates Raven had transmitted. "Turns out death didn't take." The invisible aircraft cut through the storm like a vengeful spirit, carrying evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. But behind her, she could see the lights of other aircraft launching from the base, the remaining prototypes, armed and ready for their original mission. The war for invisible skis had begun, and Phantom was outnumbered 6-1. The Ghostwind's quantum sensors painted a tactical picture that would have been impossible for conventional aircraft to perceive. Through the storm's chaos, she could track the 6 pursuing prototypes by their gravitational disturbances and electromagnetic signatures, even though they were as invisible to normal detection as she was. They were spreading into a hunting formation, trying to box her in before she could reach friendly airspace. But they'd made the same mistake everyone made when facing Phantom. They assumed she would run. Instead, she banked hard left and climbed, using the storm cells as three-dimensional terrain. Lightning crashed around the Ghostwind's quantum field, creating a light show that would have been beautiful if it wasn't accompanying what might be humanity's first battle between invisible aircraft. Ghost leader to ghost formation, Thorne's voice crackled over the tactical frequency. Target is military trained. Use extreme caution. Military trained. As if that somehow captured the reality of what Phantom represented. Zara had been forged in conflicts that existed only in classified files, shaped by missions that had pushed the boundaries of what a single pilot could accomplish. The men pursuing her were test pilots and special operations veterans, but they'd never faced an opponent who'd been officially erased from existence. Her phone buzzed. Phantom, friendly assets launching from Norfolk. ETA 12 minutes. 12 minutes. She had to survive 12 minutes against 6 invisible aircraft while flying a prototype she'd learned to operate under fire. The math wasn't encouraging. Ghost 2 was closing from her starboard side, trying to achieve a weapons lock with systems that didn't officially exist. She could see the targeting laser's distortion in the storm clouds, a subtle warping of space that her enhanced vision could just barely detect. The ghost wind responded to her evasive maneuvers like it was reading her mind, quantum systems predicting the optimal flight path through probability calculations that existed at the edge of physics. She rolled, inverted, and dove, using the storm's downdrafts to break Ghost 2's targeting solution. Jesus, Ghost 2's pilot breathed over the comm. How is she doing that? Because Phantom had learned to fly in places where physics was more suggestion than law, where survival meant trusting instruments that shouldn't work and aircraft that shouldn't fly. The ghost wind was advanced, but it was still just technology. She was something else entirely. Ghost 3 and Ghost 4 were converging from her 6 o'clock, trying to set up a classic pincer movement. But they were thinking in 2 dimensions, constrained by training that assumed horizontal engagement patterns. Zara pulled the ghost wind into a vertical climb that should have stalled the aircraft, but the quantum propulsion system responded by creating thrust vectors that violated conservation of momentum. She rose through the storm like a meteor in reverse, emerging above the cloud layer into clear sky where stars provided navigation references that couldn't be jammed. The pursuing aircraft followed, their pilots pushing their own prototypes to match her impossible maneuvers. But now they were silhouetted against the storm clouds below, their cloaking systems less effective against the cosmic background radiation. There, Ghost Leader called out. Visual contact, Angels 25 bearing. His transmission cut off as Zara dove back into the storm, using the electromagnetic chaos to mask her position while she checked her remaining assets. Fuel was good, systems nominal, but she was still flying an unarmed aircraft against 6 opponents who were carrying weapons designed to destroy targets they couldn't see. Her satellite phone displayed a new message. Phantom, this is Norfolk Control. Package inbound, Vector 90, Angels 15. She looked toward the indicated bearing and saw them. 4 F-22 Raptors in tight formation, their stealth coatings making them ghosts against the storm. Not invisible like the prototypes, but hard enough to track that they might even the odds. Norfolk Control, this is Phantom, she transmitted. Be advised you're engaging invisible hostiles. Recommend you trust instruments over visual. Copy Phantom, we've been briefed on the threat. Raven sends his regards. The cavalry had arrived, but the prototypes were already adapting their tactics. Ghost Leader was coordinating a simultaneous attack from multiple vectors, trying to overwhelm the F-22's targeting systems with too many invisible threats. What followed was unlike any air combat in human history. Invisible aircraft maneuvering against each other in 3-dimensional chess patterns, using storm clouds as cover and quantum sensors to track opponents who existed more as probability distributions than physical objects. The first F-22 died before its pilot even knew he was under attack, Ghost 5's weapons simply materializing from empty air to tear the Raptor apart. But his sacrifice revealed Ghost 5's position long enough for his wingman to return fire conventional missiles, chasing quantum distortions through the storm. Ghost 5 is down, someone screamed over the comm. They can target us. Maintain formation, Thorne ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. Complete the mission. The mission. Even now, with their conspiracy exposed and their aircraft engaged in combat, they were still planning to carry out strikes against civilian targets. Zara realized with growing horror that the prototypes weren't trying to escape. They were trying to break through to their original objectives. The air battle was just a delaying action, while the real attack proceeded on schedule. She had to end this quickly, before invisible death found its way to unsuspecting cities around the world. The realization that the prototypes were heading for their original targets changed everything. This wasn't just a pursuit. It was a race to prevent mass casualties on a scale that would reshape global history. Zara pushed the Ghostwind beyond its design parameters, quantum systems screaming warnings as she overtaxed propulsion and cloaking systems simultaneously. The aircraft responded with the desperate obedience of a machine being asked to transcend its physical limitations. 2 F-22s remained from the Norfolk Squadron, their pilots adapting rapidly to the impossible task of fighting enemies they couldn't see. But the prototypes were scattering now, each one heading for a different target in a coordinated strike pattern that would be almost impossible to intercept. All units, this is Phantom, she broadcast on all frequencies. The invisible aircraft are heading for major population centers. I'm transmitting target coordinates now. Her fingers danced across the Ghostwind's interface, uploading the mission data she'd stolen to every military and civilian air traffic control system within range. Within seconds, every defense installation on the eastern seaboard would know what was coming. Ghost Leader's voice cut through the storm. Phantom, you don't understand what you're preventing. Those targets aren't innocent cities, they're cover for biological weapons facilities. We're stopping World War IV before it starts. Even if that's true, she replied, banking hard to intercept Ghost 3's trajectory toward Washington, D.C. Killing millions of civilians isn't the answer. Sometimes it's the only answer. The Ghostwind closed on Ghost 3 like a predator made of mathematics and quantum uncertainty. Both aircraft were invisible to conventional sensors, but their quantum signatures created interference patterns in the storm's electromagnetic field. She could track her opponent by the way lightning bent around his aircraft's distortion field. Ghost 3's pilot was good, military-trained, as Thorne had said, but he'd been trained to fight conventional opponents with conventional weapons. He'd never faced someone who treated physics like a polite suggestion and aircraft like extensions of her own will. She closed to knife-fighting distance in the storm, using the Ghostwind's superior maneuverability to stay inside Ghost 3's turning radius. Without weapons, she had to get creative, and creativity had always been Phantom's greatest strength. The collision was precise, calculated. She used the Ghostwind's reinforced wing to shear off Ghost 3's starboard control surface, sending the prototype tumbling through the storm in an uncontrolled spin. The pilot ejected somewhere over the Chesapeake Bay, his parachute invisible but traceable by its effect on radar scatter. 1 down, 5 to go. But the maneuver had cost her precious fuel and revealed her position to the remaining prototypes. Ghost Leader and Ghost 6 were converging on her location, while Ghosts 2, 4, and 7 continued toward their targets. Phantom, Norfolk Control, crackled through her headset. Additional support inbound. Coast Guard and Navy assets are scrambling, but they can't see the targets. Copy Norfolk. I'm painting them with targeting data now. She began broadcasting continuous position updates on the remaining prototypes, using the Ghostwind's quantum sensors to track their signatures and relay coordinates to conventional forces. It was like being a forward observer for an artillery barrage, except the shells were missiles, and the targets were invisible death machines. Ghost Leader was closing fast, his aircraft's weapon systems finally achieving lock-on. Zara felt the familiar pre-death calm settle over her, that crystalline moment when time slowed and every option became visible. She could run. The Ghostwind was faster than Ghost Leader's prototype, and she might be able to lead him away from populated areas. She could fight. Even without weapons, Phantom had never lost an air-to-air engagement when survival was on the line. Or she could do something that would ensure the other prototypes never reached their targets, regardless of what happened to her. The decision came with the clarity of absolute certainty. Norfolk Control, this is Phantom. Tell Raven the package is delivered and the sky belongs to everyone. She banked the Ghostwind toward Ghost Leader's incoming aircraft, pushing the quantum propulsion system past Redline. The prototype screamed through the storm like a comet, its cloaking field beginning to fluctuate under the impossible stress. Ghost Leader realized what she was planning a split second before impact. Phantom, don't. The collision occurred at a combined speed that turned both aircraft into expanding clouds of exotic matter and shattered dreams. But in that moment of mutual destruction, something unexpected happened. The quantum fields of both aircraft, stressed beyond their design limits and catastrophically interfering with each other, created a resonance cascade that propagated through the storm's electromagnetic matrix. Every invisible aircraft within 50 miles suddenly became visible to every radar system on the eastern seaboard. The remaining prototypes, their cloaking systems failing in sequence, found themselves naked in a sky full of interceptors that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Ghost 2 died first, torn apart by missiles from an F-16 squadron that had been vectored to his last known position. Ghost 4 tried to run, but his coordinates were being continuously updated by a dozen different tracking systems. Ghost 7, closest to his target, actually managed to overfly downtown Baltimore before a surface-to-air missile from Fort McHenry reduced him to smoking debris raining down on the inner harbor. By the time the storm cleared, 6 prototype aircraft had been destroyed, and the shadow conspiracy behind them had been exposed to intelligence agencies around the world. But Lieutenant Colonel Zara Akafer, call sign Phantom, was officially dead for the second time in her career. The woman who had prevented invisible warfare from reshaping human civilization had vanished into the same classified darkness that had created her. 3 months later, a woman with different identification papers and a carefully constructed past walked into a small aviation museum in Kansas. She paused before a display about experimental aircraft, reading the placard that mentioned several prototypes that had been lost during testing. The museum guard, a retired Air Force sergeant, noticed her lingering at the display. "You seem to know something about military aviation," he said conversationally. "A little," she replied, her voice carrying the subtle accent of someone who had spent time in many different places. "I used to fly." "What kind of aircraft?" She smiled, an expression that contained both profound sadness and unshakable resolve. "The kind that never officially existed." Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, but for the first time in years, the sky felt truly peaceful. The invisible war had ended before it began, fought by pilots whose names would never appear in history books, in aircraft that had been erased from all records. But sometimes the most important victories were the ones nobody would ever know about. The retired sergeant watched her walk away, something about her bearing nagging at his memory. There had been stories, whispered among old-timers, about a pilot called Phantom, someone who could fly anything with wings and had saved more lives than anyone would ever know. But those were just stories, weren't they? The woman disappeared into the parking lot, driving away in a nondescript sedan that attracted no attention. She had a new identity, a new life, and enough money hidden in various accounts to live comfortably without ever having to explain where it came from. But in her glove compartment, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a single ceramic knife and a satellite phone that would connect her to people who might someday need Phantom to return. Because the sky was vast, and there were always new threats rising toward the stars. The woman who had once been Phantom drove through the Kansas countryside, past wheat fields that stretched to the horizon like a golden ocean. The radio played classic rock, the kind of music that belonged to a simpler time when war was fought by soldiers you could see and aircraft that showed up on radar. She'd chosen Kansas deliberately, flat, open, honest country where the sky went on forever and people minded their own business. The kind of place where someone could disappear without really disappearing, staying close enough to civilization to monitor the world but far enough away to be forgotten. Her new identity was solid. Dr. Elena Vasquez, aerospace engineering consultant. The credentials were real, earned through years of experience that couldn't be faked even if the name attached to them was fictional. She'd already received several job offers from companies that designed aircraft for the civilian market, work that would let her keep flying without the weight of classified missions. But she knew it wouldn't last. People like Phantom never really retired, they just waited for the next call. The satellite phone remained silent for now, but the world was still full of General Thorns and shadow conspiracies. Someone would eventually decide that invisible aircraft were worth the risk, or that biological weapons needed to be deployed preemptively, or that democracy was too messy for global security. When that day came, Elena Vasquez would disappear and Phantom would return. She pulled into the driveway of a small farmhouse that sat on 40 acres of Kansas prairie. The previous owner had been a crop duster who died peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a property that included a private airstrip and a hangar large enough for a small aircraft. Perfect for someone who needed to stay ready. The hangar was empty now, but she'd already made arrangements to purchase a restored P-51 Mustang from a collector in Texas. Not for combat, those days were officially over, but because some things in life required wings, and the sky was the only place she'd ever felt truly free. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson, Elena stood in her empty hangar and remembered the feeling of the ghost wind, responding to her, well, like an extension of her own body. The quantum-enhanced aircraft had been a marvel of engineering, capable of maneuvers that should have been impossible. But in the end, it had been just another machine. The real magic had always been the pilot. Her phone buzzed, not the satellite phone, but her regular civilian device. A text message from her new neighbor, inviting her to a barbecue next weekend. Normal life, normal relationships, normal problems that didn't involve preventing world wars or fighting invisible enemies. She typed back her acceptance, then walked outside to watch the stars emerge in the clear Kansas sky. Somewhere up there, commercial aircraft were following predictable routes between predictable destinations, their positions tracked by air traffic control systems that worked exactly the way they were supposed to. No invisible threats, no quantum cloaking, no pilots flying missions that officially never happened. Just ordinary people living ordinary lives under an ordinary sky. For now, that was enough. But Elena Vasquez kept her ceramic knife sharp and her satellite phone charged, because Phantom understood something that civilians never could. Peace was not the absence of war, but the presence of those willing to fight wars that others would never know about. The prairie wind carried the sound of distant thunder, or maybe it was just aircraft from the nearby Air Force base conducting routine training exercises. Either way, it was a sound that meant home to someone who had spent her life in the sky. Elena smiled and went inside to plan her new life, while Phantom waited in the shadows for the next call that would summon her back to the invisible war that never really ended. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but the sky remained peaceful. For now,